action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try.
Hello and welcome to Call to Action, the go-to podcast for anyone trying to make sense of the world of marketing, advertising and beyond. In an industry that is a minefield of utter bollocks, we aim to capture our heroes and allies from the front line to have a chinwag with. It's like Pokemon Go, with the single but vital exception that it's not a short-term bandwagon of shite. It's brought to you by Gasp, and I'm Giles Edwards, co-founder and MD. Today I've caught Drayton Bird, a man who could fill the British Library twice over with his stories of mayhem and misadventure. Drayton is one of the all-time greats in the world of copywriting. He's helped sell everything from Airbus planes to Peppa Pig, worked in 55 countries, been stabbed 3 times, lived under a false name at least once, and been dubbed the man who knows more about direct marketing than anyone in the world by David Ogilvy. There's no doubt he's earned his multiple Lifetime Achievement Awards. Drayton says, don't try to be clever. Just give every good reason why people should do what you want and overcome every sensible objection they might have. Welcome to the show, Drayton.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Giles.
Right, 7 quickfire questions, Drayton. Beer or wine?
Wine.
Reading or writing?
Reading.
Count Dracula or Count Kapinski?
Kapinski.
Donkey Carpaccio or horse in Kazakhstan?
Donkey Carpaccio.
Be original or steal?
Steal.
Right, 2 more. The best David. David Abbott or David Ogilvy?
David Ogilvy.
And the last one, it's a Caples versus Ogilvy here. So they laughed when I sat down at the piano, but when I started to play, or at 60 miles an hour, the loudest noise in this new Rolls Royce comes from the electric clock.
They laughed.
They laughed. Brilliant. Drayton, you sailed through those. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
On Call to Action, we like to celebrate the linear and more often not so linear paths that guests have taken to get where they are. And you've been writing for a living for over 60 years now, worked with so many of the world's greatest brands and lived a life that you describe as 85 years as of Sunday, happy birthday, of misadventure, mayhem and millions. But before all that, what was your first ever job? And then what was your first proper copywriting job?
I got a scholarship to Manchester University and I found it incredibly boring. And during the Spanish oral, at the end of the first year, the lady said, "¿Y cómo le gusta la universidad?" And I said, "No me gusta mucho." And she said, she was quite surprised. And she said, "Oh, what are you going to do? Why?" And I said, "Well, it's less interesting than my father's pub. And I'm going to be a writer." And she said, "You're going to be," I said, "I'm going to leave. I'm going to be a writer." And she said, "When are you going to leave?" And I said, "Now." And I left. And then I tried to get a job as a writer. And it took me a couple of months. And I got a job for a magazine that doesn't exist anymore now called Cotton, because that was in those days there was a big cotton industry where I was, which was in Manchester. And I used to write the editorials. So I was 19 coming up to 20. And I used to lecture the American Secretary of State for Agriculture on where he was going wrong. And unfortunately, I'd also discovered, this was the time when sex was first discovered, but contraception wasn't discovered by me. But I ended up with a young family. And a friend of mine, a very well-connected man, belonged to what was then known as the Princess Margaret set, said, "You do well in advertising." I had no idea what advertising was. And so I went to the Manchester Public Library and I got out all the books in advertising, both of them. And I read one of them, part of one of them. I didn't read the other one because it was rubbish. And the one I read was all about copywriting. And I loved the idea of writing and I loved the idea of persuading people. And that's how I decided I want to be a copywriter. And then I joined a course, and at the end of the first term, because at that time I was living in a 2 up and 2 down house in Manchester, the only one in the row with a bath. And I was desperate, and I went to the guy who was teaching us, and I said, oh, I'm desperate. I must get a job, And he said, oh, I can't help you, but I'll send you to someone who can. And he sent me to the guy, the advertising manager of the Co-op, who ran the Manchester Publicity Association. And he interviewed me, and I judiciously lied, misrepresented, and flattered. And he got me an interview with an agency in Liverpool. And I went there, and the guy who interviewed me said, look, we don't take on copywriters. You have to go through the ranks. And I said, well, I'm desperate and blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, why should I hire you? I mean, what can you do? And I said, well, I know a lot about people, and I think understanding people is the key. And he said, why do you say you know a lot about people? I said, because I was brought up in a pub, and you see people at their best and worst. And then he said, what other reason should I give you a job? I said, because I can write. And he said, really? And I said, yeah. I said, here's some of the stuff I've written for Cotton magazine. And he looked at it and he said, it's true, you can. And then he said, what other reason? He said, well, I think, so I said, well, I think to be a copywriter, you've got to have a fund of knowledge about all sorts of things. You've got to be incessantly curious. And he said, oh, really? He said, can you tell me the difference between the way a 2-stroke engine works and a 4-stroke engine works? Now, I can't even bloody drive. To this day, I cannot drive a car. But I did, by chance, happen to know the answer to that question. And he said, oh, we'll give you a try. He said, how much are you getting paid? And I said, £6.13 and 7pence after tax a week. This is now you know what's happened to money. And he said, oh, we'll pay you that. And I said, but I've got to come from Ashton-under-Lyne on the other side of Manchester here to Liverpool. And he said, all right, we'll give you £2 extra. And that's how I started.
It's a good point. Your initial response to him about people from being brought up in a pub. Funnily enough, a couple of weeks ago, we had the pleasure of talking to one of your, I suppose, most famous students, if that's the right word, Steve Harrison. And he mentioned a similar point about growing up in Blackpool, which taught him everything he needed to know about people by the time he was 16. But after 16, there's nothing left to learn.
Well, I don't know whether I don't agree with it. There's nothing left to learn after 16, but maybe Steve's smarter than me. Quite possibly, actually. He's a very clever man. There are two people I discovered that I think are very good, and he's one. And he was working in. We had a little library in at Ogilvy and Mather Direct, which I ran in London, and then helped to run around the world. And he was sitting there, and I said, oh, and I used to manage by walking around. I had no office. Actually, David Ogilvy came in once after we'd sold the business to him, and he said, Drayton, he said, what do you actually do? He said, you're not the managing director, you're not the chairman, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm in charge of entertainment, David. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, it's my job to make sure people arrive early, leave late, and enjoy the intervening period as much as possible. So I used to walk around with a leopard skin hat on and all sorts of things to keep people entertained. But yes, so he wasn't really all that happy, Steve. And I said, what would you really like to do? And he said, well, I'd like to be right. And I said, oh, well, I'll arrange to get a brief for you. And that's how I started writing copy. Very, very able man and extremely eccentric. I recommend eccentricity to everyone. If you're like everyone else, you're never likely to come up with different ideas to everyone else, and in which case you're not likely to succeed. So I do recommend being a bit strange. But
was there much eccentricity in the agency in Liverpool then? So that first start that you had?
Was there? There wasn't really. It was a successful agency, but nothing remarkable. What was good about it, and what was good fortune for me, was that the first jobs I had, there was no idea about this above the line and below the line, blah, blah, blah. The the only thing that matters in our business is, can you persuade people to do what you want them to do? And so the first 3 jobs I had, as I recall, one was to write copy about some restaurants around Liverpool. And because my parents had a restaurant, I knew a lot about that. And one was to write what's known as a salesman's organizer. And that was like a crib sheet that the salesmen carry around when they were doing a pitch to their prospects. And that was for Richmond pork sausages. And the third thing was to write a brochure about seed cleaning machinery. And so by good fortune, I fell immediately into a condition where you were expected to write about anything, and you were expected to be able to tackle any marketing challenge. So I do think good fortune helps, and that was good fortune for me. I had a chap who taught me called Hugh Edwards, I think Hugh Evans, lovely man. He was good. They had a library there. How many agencies have libraries now? I mean, half the people in advertising haven't read a bloody book about copywriting. They think it's something you pick up like diphtheria. The depth of knowledge available then, I think, was greater than it is now. I think, and also today, marketing is segmented needlessly between online and offline and this and that and the other. So you get people told that you've got a whole school of people who are only interested in digital marketing. This is quite insane. The principles do not change, no matter what the medium is. You're always trying to persuade people to do what you want them to do, and you should understand all media, and you should try and understand everything. One of my joys in my latter years, in my senile years, is if somebody comes along to me and asks me to write a copy about something I've never heard of before. I like to acquire knowledge about things I know nothing about. If you keep writing about the same things, you'll get samey, It limits your capabilities. That's why, I think that's why, there are very few old copywriters. Think about it. I'm 300 bloody years old. I never expected to live to 85. I never expected to live to 75. Actually, I was very lucky to live beyond 18, because the day after my 18th birthday, I was run over by a car, and I was expected to die. I'm the first person to recover from a ruptured liver in the north of England.
Yeah, I've read that. I've also read you've been stabbed 3 times, so I agree. It's surprising that you're still with us, Drayton.
Well, no, the stabbing is different. That's just women provoked beyond the call of endurance, but with bad targeting abilities.
They need digital targeting tools, do they, bollocks? I asked you deliberately in the quickfire questions at the start, reading or writing, and I did it in part knowing that you are a prolific reader, but then you've also kind of reinforced that point and perhaps shared a reason why, which is learning about new things or new products that you might be required to sell. So would you say that reading is a fundamental for probably all marketers, but specifically for copywriters?
If you can't read, you can't write. I think one of the great problems with most copywriters and most writers, anybody trying to do anything actually, is a lack of imagination, which is caused by a lack of broad knowledge. Whenever somebody tells me something I'd never heard of before, I'm delighted. Whenever a client comes, I think I said before, when a client comes along and asks me to sell something I've never heard of before, I'm delighted. For instance, if all you do is read about marketing, God help you. If all you read about copywriting, God help you. If you take somebody like David Ogilvy, David was very, very well read. But the other problem, I think, is if you go into the advertising, marketing, copywriting business without having done anything else, then your horizons are very narrow indeed. And successful communication comes from producing something which is relevant but surprising. And the possibility of you coming up with something surprising if you don't know very much is very, very low indeed.
Yeah, of
You
course.
can't, I mean, I was quoting, I write an email 5 days a week, and I was quoting Anara and Bevan, who founded the National Health Service. And I was looking for something which relates to me writing some copy about a magazine, which you may have heard of, called The Oldie, which has been described as the best magazine in the English language by an eminent American publisher. And the thing is that unless you read a wide range of things, and pick up odd things along the way, you're just going to sound like everyone else. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you're not stuffing yourself with knowledge about many things, you can't. I mean, nobody would normally, I think, say to you, "You've got to write an email about a magazine. What do you think the subject line should be?" And I don't think many people would say, "Stuff their mouths with gold." Yeah? Because not many people know who the bloody hell Anara Bevan was, because people don't read or study. They don't know what he said, and they can't link it, as I then did in the draft I've written so far, to COVID. Yeah. So what keeps people reading is when you say things that are surprising but relevant. And if you don't know a lot, you're not able to come out with anything that's surprising or bloody relevant. Yeah. So you spew out the same rubbish as everyone else. And you mentioned Rory Sutherland. And the reason why Rory is remarkable, apart from saying nice things about me occasionally, is he's got a very, very wide range of knowledge. So he comes up with ideas that other people don't come up with. If you look at the world in this from the same direction, with the same perspective, with the same range of knowledge as everyone else, you're going to end up like everyone else. And if you end up like everyone else, quite frankly, you might just as well never have bloody well lived. In other words, the whole point of your existence, if you're like everyone else, is gone. Yeah? You're just, you're not, it's impossible for you to leave a mark on the world. And I think that we should try to contribute, shouldn't we? We should try and leave a mark. We should try and do something that will influence other people. And we will only do that if we don't say the same things as everyone else. Yeah,
And I guess I was going to ask about your principles for writing, but I think before I ask you to share any more, your point there about being relevant but surprising, or surprising and relevant, is wonderful. Clearly very, very true and wise. And it's similar to I suppose Ogilvy himself said you cannot bore people into buying. We had the CEO of Saatchi and Saatchi, Richard Huntington, who I spoke to recently, and I think he said something along the lines of, "It's better to be interesting than it is to be right." Sometimes, and of course, Disney famously said, "I'd rather entertain and hope people learn something than try to educate people and hope they were entertained." So I guess that's got to be a first hook, hasn't it, in terms of how you persuade people?
Yeah, if you don't seize people's attention, you won't get anywhere. This is the biggest challenge. Your two biggest challenges are, number one, how can I get people to pay attention? And number two, how can I get people to do something? Most people don't understand the intervening steps, which are pretty much as important. Get people's attention, get them interested, get them emotionally, fill them with desire, and convince them that you're not bullshitting them, and then get them to do something. That's the trick, isn't it?
Yeah. And you can't possibly do that without knowledge. So how do you do that I mentioned Airbus planes and Peppa Pig, two wildly diverse things that you've helped sell. How do you do that for those two examples?
Well, it depends what it is. I mean, both those jobs I did years ago when I was living under a false name, during that period, I owed so much money to the Inland Revenue, I had to duck and dive.
You sound like my late dad.
Well, one of the things I did was I was a freelance creative director, and I was a freelance creative director for for several agencies simultaneously. One of them had the Airbus account. And so the first thing I wanted to know was what was different about the Airbus. That's the way you start. Yeah? What was different about this? You must start by asking what's different about this, because what you're trying to do is make people choose and choose you. And you can't do that until you can define what makes you different, which is the reason why people will choose you. Well, the thing that was different about the Airbus was that it only had 2 engines, where all the other planes at that time had 4 engines. So being ignorant, I said, how come it could fly with only 2 engines? And I had no recollection at all of what I wrote, but I know that's where it started. So it always starts by, well, Dr. Johnson, who's one of my favourite writers of all time, once said, curiosity is not the mode of conversation amongst gentlemen. And I think in one of my books, I think Common Sense Direct and Digital Marketing, I say it may not be the mode of conversation amongst gentlemen, but it is amongst copywriters. David said that you've got to be insatiably curious. To one of the criteria whereby he judged the likelihood that you could become a good copywriter. Curiosity. I can't remember a damn thing about the little animal.
Oh, Peppa Pig. Mm.
Yeah, Peppa. Except I love Peppa Pig. I absolutely adore all things childish, and I live here. I have with a former business partner. Well, my private life is really bizarre, but one of the people I live with is a 4-year-old little girl, and I learn a lot from her because she's always asking me to do the most. She's got a totally different perspective on life. Yeah. See, children don't have any filters that say you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that. So we spend a lot of time playing mummy and daddy, except that very often, or mummy and daddy and baby, very often I'm the baby, not the mummy or the daddy. And very often I could be different animals. I could be a pig, I could be all sorts of things,
Yeah. And sometimes you don't even know. Well, I mentioned before we started recording about my 2 daughters who are 5 and 4 years old respectively, and funnily enough, I was honoured to provide an interview for a new magazine that's launched. It's a brilliant magazine called Freelancer Magazine, and I made the same point as what inspires me, if inspire isn't too strong a word, and it was my 2 girls, because as you say, they've got no filter and they've got no preconceived ideas of how things should be, or that kind of etiquette that people expect people to behave or talk in a certain way. And my eldest, who I say eldest, she's only 5, she regularly has a go at the sky or the moon if it's still in the sky in the morning because it's the sun's turn.
No, that makes perfect sense. That sounds very, very much like Emma.
Yeah, but I adore it. It's brilliant.
Well, the thing is that children are creative, and at some point they start to grow up, which is a big mistake to grow up. I think one should be childish. I'll give you an example of my last wife and I was speaking in Cannes, and this is years ago, we had a very nice red car, a Lotus Esprit Turbo, and we drove to David's chateau in where we were staying for the weekend. We arrived in the car and David looked at the car and he said, that's beautiful. What's the name of that car? And my wife said, it's a Lotus Esprit Turbo. And the next day David said to her, can we go for a drive in your beautiful car? So I said, of course, not that it was me, because the women always boss me around. So they went to drive into the local town, and at one point David said to Cece, my wife, "How do you wind the window down? Where's the window winder?" And Cece said, "No, you just press this button." And he said, "Can you open the window?" So he pressed the button, and he looked out of the window and he said, "Slow down, very slow." And then he waved in a very lordly fashion towards somebody in the town. And then he turned to my wife and he said, "That's the local mayor. He hates me." I have to say, David and I had some hysterically funny moments. I remember his wife was going away to Paris, and he said we're going, and she said, "What would you like to eat? Shall I get the chef to make something for you to eat?" And I said, "Well, we saw a hare coming, when we were coming here. What, jugged hare?" And David said, "Oh, you can't get jugged hare. It's impossible to get hare." So I said, "What about rabbit?" And David said, "When I was young and we were poor, we had to eat rabbit all the time. Rabbit will never be served in this house, the house being a chateau, And so the next day, along came some rabbit, and David looked at me and he said, "This is your doing."
Did he eat rabbit?
Yeah, I think he ate it. And I mean, his family was very poor when he was young, and he actually lived near my secretary, now unfortunately no longer with us, a wonderful woman, but they lived near each other. They didn't know each other, but when he met her, they talked about it. That's the other thing about him. People that succeed start to feel full of themselves. In that respect, David did not feel full of himself, although he could be an absolute pig. I remember when I went to India, he sent me to India, which he was very fond of. My friend now, or still a friend, who was running Ogilvy Direct, told me about David in a restaurant in New Delhi where we were eating, actually, when he told me about it. And David had gone there, and the chef had discovered that David, of course, had been a chef when he was younger. And so the chef was very interested and came and hovered and asked him what he would like to eat. And David said cornflakes, because he could be an absolute shit, He really could. And he was only rude once to me when I was too loud at breakfast, but I was very lucky.
Right.
Yeah. Anyhow, that's all gossip. What else would you like me to gossip about?
I'd like you to gossip about business, and particularly business baloney, because I've heard you say that business seemed fairly simple when you began, despite obviously a slight detour of living under a false name for several years. But what do you think has changed? Has business become a bit more of an exercise in waffle and irrelevance? Is there the same level of bullshit around nowadays there always was, or has that got worse?
I think there's more. Of course, the old men, always moan about everything, so I'm probably talking nonsense. But somebody who works with me sent out an email describing themselves as a chief operating officer. And I dropped a line this morning. I said, "Please don't use that phrase, that title, unless you're planning to join the National Health Service." I think there's so much inflated drivel floating around to a greater. I mean, of course, our business is the art of exaggeration. Painting things in bright colours. But I do think that people have become incredibly self-important, needlessly and foolishly. You quoted the chap, the very funny Bob Hoffman.
Yes.
He's a good chap because he doesn't put up with all that piffle. He blows the people up. Icarus must have been told 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, 3,000 or 4 years. This thing about somebody flying too close to the sun. It's really a sort of a way of describing people feeling that they were better than they were. People tend to feel better than they were. The only conclusion I can come to about my own self is that I'm not nearly as good as some people tell me I am, because I almost every time I'm given anything significant to write, I'm filled with panic and misery.
Yes.
And I'm convinced that I'll never come up with another idea, and that if I do, it won't work, and so on and so on. I recommend despair as the route to success.
I was going to ask that, actually. Are you recommending despair? Is that panic and misery, I suppose, combined with that obsessive curiosity? Presumably, that's how you've managed to put so much into copywriting for so long.
Yeah, fear of failure, up to me, I have two sayings. One is that the road to success lies through failure, and the other one is the road to failure lies through success. The minute you start thinking you're doing well, you're going to get slap happy, you know.
That's exactly what happened about, what's the time now? About 45, 50 minutes ago, Drayton. I said to my wife, Christ, I feel really underprepared for today's podcast recording with Drayton, because I have got a wad of research here that I've been obsessively reading through, but there's so much. And she just said, yeah, but you feel like that every time you talk to someone you admire. And I think there's a truth there, which is, if I had said to her, oh, I feel really prepared, then it would have been completely wrong. Maybe there's a parallel there.
No, I totally agree. I think a sense of inadequacy. There's a good story about, which is relevant to the art of coming up with ideas, about Beethoven and I think Schubert walking along the street one day in Austria, somewhere I've been to, but I can't remember the name of it. And they heard somebody playing Mozart on the piano above them, from a house above them. And Beethoven turned to Schubert and said, "You and I will never write anything as good as that." Now that's the right approach. If you've got that sort of approach, then you've got some chance of writing something that's any good. I find it incredibly hard to find anything that I've ever done that was any good. And when I do briefly think it is any good, I look at it and realise I should have done so and so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely this feeling that you're not good enough you're going to try harder.
I think some people have coined it the Dunning-Kruger effect, where there's that inverse proportion between that self-inflated confidence and superiority is often inversely proportional to your actual talent, and it's why I think lots of people suffer what's known as imposter syndrome, where they just think they find themselves in the wrong job and they don't really know what they're doing, and they panic, and they're often the people that are actually very smart and capable, but it's that panic and misery, I think you said earlier, which I loved. I want one last point on the business baloney and bullshit, and you're right to point to Bob Hoffman, who I often refer to as an American bulldog, because I think he's great at calling it out. I have found I've ranted about bullshit in the industry this is our 70th episode, so I'm mindful of doing that too much. The way I try and justify it, or I find it quite difficult to know what side of the fence I'm on, is that on one side of the fence you've got people who, you use the example chief operating officer. I would suggest it's much worse. You've got people calling themselves growth gurus and marketing wizards and all sorts of complete nonsense. But then on the other side, I remember Mark Ritson making the point in one of his classes I was in, which is, yes, but marketing is a blood sport. So if the wizards and gurus are succeeding and earning more money, how can you fault them? And that actually knocked me for six, because I suddenly thought, actually, that's a really good point. If all of the bullshit peddlers out there are enjoying success, however we define success, then maybe there's room for it. But I've never found that a comfortable conclusion.
Competence is all we aim for. Mark Ritson, actually, I've never met him. He wrote about, a couple of years ago, he said I was one of the only 3 people he followed, but he never answers any messages from me. So I'm impressed by his ability to talk, but less impressed by his ability to do.
Right. Yeah. All reply.
And I once wrote to him years ago. I said, "Oh, you're teaching people all about marketing. Can you tell me about the products that you sold?" Never got a reply. Those who can do teach, those who cannot. Those who can do, those who cannot teach.
Yeah, and those who cannot do, teach PE or gym. That's a quote from the School of Rock.
Well, I must say, I think Mark Ritson does say he's very perceptive, he's very intelligent, and he is a good example of somebody who does know how to grab people's attention. He's a master of the outrageous.
Yeah, absolutely. And I listeners to this podcast will know I'm a huge fan of his, and I've done both of his mini MBA classes. But one of the main reasons I admire him for what he does is he's not only a teacher of sorts, but he's actually practices what he teaches. So I think he splits his time roughly 50-50 between being a marketing consultant / practitioner, whatever title he might give himself, and teaching. And I, funnily enough, I've got 2 listener questions I'd like to put to you, Drayton, and one of them is about the state of education. So, asking the general public for their opinion, be it on Brexit or boat names, is notoriously fraught with danger, but that's not stopped us asking listeners for questions. So, as usual, we've got 2, starting with Chris from Oxford. Chris asks, despite walking out on a degree at the University of Manchester, you've since lectured there and around the world. What do you think of the state of marketing education, and what do you think is the best way to learn?
I think the best way to learn is by doing and by reading. It was an unkind remark of George Bernard Shaw's about those who can do and those who cannot teach, but I think there's a great deal of truth in it. Many, many years ago, I was approached by the Chartered Institute of Marketing to run the first ever residential marketing course, regular marketing course, a direct marketing course. And I did it for 2 years and then I quit. And they said, why are you quitting? I said, because you don't believe in marketing. And they said, what do you mean? I said, because I've been running this course, you've never promoted it. How are these people? Do you believe in marketing by osmosis by any chance? It's certainly true that, a lot of people who failed or have come to the end of their useful life, so to speak, will then get a job teaching marketing. And because marketing is a relatively new discipline, if you can call it a discipline, you've got a lot of second-rate people going around teaching. I think I'm inadequate, but when I look at some of the other people, I start to feel vaguely adequate. Because it's a new discipline. Remember that the first time marketing was written anywhere that I'm aware of was 1904. And there is a fantasy in the marketing world that this is a profession. It's not a profession. Medicine is a profession. People have been practicing medicine for 5,000, 6,000, however long. The same thing with the law. 5,000 years since the first legal, set of legal rules or whatever, tablets, Hammurabi or someone, marketing 1904. And you think this is a profession? And it's a profession where most of the people, in fact, don't measure anything. And when they do, they measure the wrong things. It's a bit of a joke, isn't it? Bit of a joke, yeah. So that's what I think about that.
Yeah, no, I would struggle very much to disagree with you. I think learning by doing has always been my preference. Not to say I haven't also sought education, but I've specifically sought education with people who I think are the right types of people to learn from, like Mark Ritson. And we, as an agency, we employ grads, and some of them come and talk about what they've learned, what they've been studying for 3 years at university, at great cost, I might add. And it's a lot of it is baloney, but I think therein lies the problem, that your marketing education can only really be as good as the person you're learning from.
Yeah, it is a problem. Ever since commerce began, people have had to try and solve things. And what's amazing to me is that most young people nowadays have not read the most important books. Most of them still haven't read Scientific Advertising, which is not only the most important, but the shortest. I once did a talk for some marketing organisation to an audience where a significant number were Ogilvy people, and most of them hadn't read Ogilvy on advertising, rather like being, you're going into the church, but you've never come across the Bible, It really is quite extraordinary.
Well, especially because the science and marketing is freely available. In fact, I think you link to it on your site, don't you? And I remember downloading and printing it, I don't know, a decade ago or however many years ago it was.
Well, Ogilvy said that this book changed the course of my life. Actually, one of the things that's driving me bloody balmy at the moment is I'm busy writing a book about Claude Hopkins, featuring a lot of his advertisements, and he wrote thousands, and it's proving a nightmare challenge because he was so good. And, he was being paid something like the equivalent of $200,000 a week in today's money for what he did. But his copy built the world's largest advertising agency, launched products that are still around, Quaker Oats, a soap, the name of which I can't remember, but still around, Palmolive. So most people in advertising have not read the most important, the shortest book about the business. I mean, it's just incredible. It's quite extraordinary. It's like you say you're going to be, I want to be a composer, but I've never listened to Mozart. I mean, come on.
I heard a brilliant retort to, I mean, you quite rightly made the point earlier, which was great to hear about media differ, but principles don't. And I heard a great retort from Tom Goodwin about, this is 3 or 4 years ago, but it stuck in my head. And somebody on LinkedIn who probably practices a bit of the marketing baloney and bullshit said, I'm doing a campaign, what's the best channel to use? And Tom replied, I'm writing a song, what's the best note to use?
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
Which I liked. Question 2 then, Drayton, I'm looking forward to this one, is from Sally, who says, your autobiography, You Did What, is overflowing with wild stories from a life well lived. If you could choose one of your stories to be turned into a movie, which would it be and how can we get it funded?
Blimey. It's funny enough, my Italian lady friend of mine said, can I see your autobiography? Which would it be? Oh, God. Very good. I suspect the thing that would... No, that's a really tricky question. I've never thought about it. I'm pretty sure, he said, off the cuff, off the nearest convenient cuff, that it would be about the 7 years where I lived under an assumed name. I can see that would work. That would actually work quite well. Those of you who don't know this and aren't interested should stop listening. The first thing is that how did I come to start the 7 years under a false name? And it was a result of my business going bankrupt. And so it would start with the creditors meeting. And what happened at the creditors meeting was that I'd had fully justified messages from people saying that they were going to come and beat the living shit out of me. So I was terrified. And I had lunch before the creditors meeting with my partner, Martin, who's a lovely man who killed himself. Not because of me, because he went into business with some crooks, the mafia-backed crooks. But so the creditors meeting, I was expecting a guy said, I'm going to come and break your legs. So I was there terrified. Martin wanted us to leave the country. And I stood up, absolutely terrified. And at the end, essentially what I said was, look, you're all grown up. You all knew what you were doing. I'm very sorry about it, blah, blah, blah. And the guy who'd come and who'd said he would break my legs came up to me afterwards and said, I'd like to shake your hand. You're obviously an honest man. It's not necessarily true. And another man, who is a very famous advertising man, John Metcalf, who has run 2 big agencies, very funny man, came up to me and he shook my hand and he said, you will undoubtedly become a millionaire. That was the beginning, yeah? So that's the terrible situation. And then these people coming up to me, and then me doing anything to make a living for 7 years and under a false name. And wonderful moments like I was known as David D. McMahon, McMahon was the name of my second wife's first husband. And we lived in a penthouse in Harley Street. How we afforded it, I don't know. But me going to see the landlord, who was a surgeon who lived down the road, and would say, "Well, Mr. McMahon," and I'm thinking, who's he talking about? Oh, it's me. And the things that went on during those 7 years, and I don't even know if they got it into the autobiography because I wrote that very, very quickly, and it probably needs rewriting considerably. And I remember one day, here's the sort of thing that happened during that period. I used to go to a pub down the road from Harley Street, and I remember meeting Bobby Moore, who I think did the winning goal in the World Cup or something. I didn't even know who he was. But I met some interesting people in that pub, and I went there one day, and we got drunk at lunchtime, and I used to drink with Bobby Butlin, who was this Butlin's holiday camps, and we went to his place in the afternoon and drank on his rooftop terrace in the sunshine, and then went back to the pub and drank some more. And my then wife, who was a Maori princess, actually, it's very sad. She's very ill now. Towards the end of the evening, there was a girl we were talking to who said, "Why don't you come back to my place and have some more drinks?" And my wife said, "No, I don't think I'll go." She said, "You should go." And of course, I was drunk, and I thought that was a sort of coded word for you should go and have a good time. So I did go and have a good time. But unfortunately, that lady and I were engaged in mutual satisfaction. Well, might speak for myself. And my wife walked down the street in corner of Harley Street and looked up and saw us in flagrante delicto from the street. That didn't help the marriage very much. But that lady that I was with that evening, later on, died tragically. She was smoking in bed and set fire to her bedclothes. But that was a day, the sort of day that I had in the 1970s, full of drama. Really sad. I remember I used to go walking the dog in the morning. We had a little Maltese, and one day there was a very beautiful girl there, and she was walking along in bare feet, holding her shoes, wearing a beautiful silk dress. And I said, "Oh, you look pretty chirpy." She said, "Yeah, I've been gambling all night." I said, "Did you do well?" She said, "Yeah." And I forgot about her. And then I ran into her. I used to be, again, one of my part-time creative directors' job in an agency down the road. And I used to go at lunchtime and never reappear. I used to go to the pub down the road. And there I met this very same lady. And we became very good friends that afternoon. And I said to her, after I'd seen her 2 or 3 times we met her, I said, "How come you can afford to live here off Harley Street? Bloody expensive." She said, "Well, I've got this old, I won't say what she called him, this old blank who gives me £1,000 a month," which was a lot of money in the 1973 or whatever it was. And I said, "Who's that?" And she said, "Here you are, here's one of his cheques." And it was a cheque for £1,000 a month from the Duke of Devonshire, who happened to be the patron of my old school, and was also a client of the girl I was living with before that, who tried to kill me. She was the first one to try and kill me. So there you are. Is that outrageous enough for you?
Yeah, that would do.
Well, that 7-year period was interesting because I had to do anything. So I sold swimming pools in France and Germany and failed to sell swimming pools in Australia, fake Chagall paintings in Australia. I did anything to make money. Many things I was frightened of doing. And you mentioned Kopinski, didn't you? Did you?
I did in the quickfire.
So Kopinski was one of the people I worked for. Count Kopinski is one of the great men who rode on horseback and charged the German tanks in 1940. And he was, I went to work for him and my job was selling. I'm terrified of the telephone. I hate it. But I had to sell malt whiskey for investment on the telephone. I was useless. I admired Kopinski because he could drink like a fish, and he was in his 60s. And I once said to him, I said, how come you drink like a fish, but you seem to be pretty fit? And he said, well, 1 day a week I don't drink. And that single piece of information probably saved my life, because I was definitely half cut for about 40 years between the 60s and the beginning of this century. So I could easily make a film out of that period, oddly enough.
Easily.
Somebody has made a film out of me actually, but I've never got around to getting it edited. So Steve Harrison keeps on saying, you should get it edited, but I need somebody cheap who will edit it.
Oh. Well, presumably Steve could help you with that, because he's done his Howard Gossage film, hasn't he?
I think, yeah, he has. He's a very interesting man, Steve. Very, very clever. A fine copywriter.
He is, yeah. He's very smart. We were fortunate enough to be invited to his book launch a few weeks ago.
Oh yeah, he's an interesting bloke, Steve. I think we're supposed to be doing something. I'm thinking of running an event next year. My last, final, utterly no more, I guarantee, events, which has been suggested to me by a friend, an Australian friend, who actually Trevor Toecracker Crook, who did come to one of my events and join me. And I'm thinking, he said, "Why don't you do another one? Do one last one." So I probably will.
Oh, wonderful!
Next year. Well, yeah, the people like them. You know, they like them. But my secret weapon is a bad sense of humour.
If it works, it works.
It sometimes works, yeah.
The final part then of our interview, Drayton, is our 4 pertinent posers that we put to all of our guests. Now, starting with, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Don't be so damned idle.
Were you idle?
I think I'm idle. I know I'm idle compared to the lady who's my landlady used to work for me, and she's infinitely more diligent than I am. I'm astonished at her diligence. I think I'm really idle, and the only thing that's kept me going is that there are a lot of other people who not only as idle as me but less well informed.
Nice. Yeah. Number 2, if you could banish one thing from the industry, what would it be and why?
I think silly titles would be a good go for that, because it gives people a false sense of competence.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that anybody who starts to think they're any good is in trouble. I mean, I realise I've said that different ways. But I remember going back to Ogilvy. My wife and I were having dinner with him and his wife and the husband and wife of an agency that Ogilvy, quite a well-known agency that Ogilvy had bought. I can't remember. Very nice people, but David had to make a speech, and he was sitting there fiddling with the cutlery, obviously very ill at ease. And I said, everybody here loves you, David. I stopped worrying. And he said, shut up. He's fear of failure. That's the trick, you know.
It's a powerful thing. Are there any books that you can recommend? Is question 3.
Well, I do think anybody who doesn't read Ogilvy on advertising is an idiot. But we've already dealt with Claude Hopkins. I do think that anybody who doesn't read John Caples is an idiot. But you've got to be very careful if you get the last edition of his best book, because it was edited by somebody who knew nothing about direct response. And so it has some examples which are misleading. But yeah, though you've got to read those books. You're quite mad if you don't. My friend Bob Bly, whom I've only met once, says that my book, How to Write a Sales Letter and Emails That Sell, is the best on the subject. And he said, and I've read them all. So that's quite a good book. It's hard for me to tell whether a book's any good, you know. Someone else has got to look at it and so. But Bob's the most knowledgeable person I know. in our business, I think. He does nothing but work, as far as I can make out, which has never been my approach at all.
Are there any books outside of industry topics, outside of advertising and copywriting, that you would recommend? You talked about reading widely.
For God's sake, there's so many books you've got to read Dickens, haven't you? You've got to read Evelyn Waugh. When I was 50, my people at Ogilvy bought me a set of the novels of Evelyn Waugh. He's an incredibly funny man. Also, not a nice man, but not many writers are. I don't think I'm as nice as I would like to think I am. Evelyn Waugh, I'll give you a quote from it, because I was, by chance at the weekend, I met somebody very distinguished. I didn't realise he was distinguished at all. But like most great men, men of merit, he was spent some time playing snakes and ladders on the floor with our little girl, he and his wife. And I won't go into details about who he is, but in fact, one of the most distinguished people I've ever met. We were talking about books, and I was talking about Evelyn Waugh. I said, there's one book that, because he's very, very cultured, he was formerly involved with the royal family. Evelyn Waugh wrote this book, which I read, and I don't know where it is. I don't think I bought it. And it was about travel. It's not one of his best known, one of his novels. It was all about he did a bit of travelling, and apparently he was on this boat, this sort of cargo boat that took passengers off the coast of South America. In fact, off the coast of the place where somebody I have a daughter with came from, Guyana. And on board this boat, they were having races between crabs. And Evelyn Waugh commented. He said, the chief problem, and I can't swear this to these exact words, but with crabs as racing animals is not so much their lack of speed as their poor sense of direction. I think that I love funny books. I wish I could write a funny book. I wish I could write a decent book. Too late now. But I love funny books. I'm looking at my bookshelf now and see there's a book. There's a series of diaries by James Lees Milne, who went around the country before the war, and I think a bit after the war, buying up or doing deals to buy up properties for the National Trust. That's a very, very funny book because he's a really bitchy, and I think his friendships were unconventional. They're very, very funny. I love people who are funny. I think life is short. We might as well have a laugh while we can. And God knows, if you're in the marketing business, you'll have a few laughs.
Right.
You gaze distraught and disbelieving and think, do these people actually making a living? Do they get paid for doing this? Does this man really believe what he's just said? Has he been on the booze for 3 days? I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. So number 4 then, Drayton, is we always dedicate every episode to someone, and we bestow or hospital pass that honour to our guest who has to give their reason why. So would you be so kind as to dedicate this episode?
Dedicate this episode to Marta Caricato. That's spelled Caricato, who came to work with me some years ago and has done considerably better than I am, and is a better person than I am, and has been very kind to me. So there you are.
Wonderful. Well, this episode is very proudly dedicated to Marta Caricato, if I've pronounced that correctly.
Not Japanese, Italian.
Italian, fantastic.
Yes, from Puglia.
My wife's favourite wine is from Puglia.
Really?
Nice. Yeah,
Which
Pilastro.
one?
It's called Pilastro.
Oh yeah, drunk that. Actually, I've drunk practically everything there is.
There's none of it left.
We actually have one, two, three. We now have 4 people from Puglia in the house, and one little girl who's half from Puglia.
You've got 4.5 in the house. Amazing. Yeah. We will list everything we've discussed in this episode online. We'll include all of your books, Drayton. We'll include some Evelyn Waugh, John Caples, the Claude Hopkins. In fact, I'll link to your site where you share a PDF of the book. Ogilvy on advertising. If that's not enough, how else can people listening get more Drayton Bird?
Well, I think most people who've been listening have had more than enough Drayton Bird. Well, if you go to draytonbird.com, that's where you'll find fraudulent misrepresentations about me. And you'll also find that if you go to the top right, you can get a copy of Scientific Advertising, which is very short. It's only 43 pages long, I think. Depends on the edition, but very short, full of wisdom. And you can also you can sign on to my mailing list. So this is a decision you may regret for the rest of your life. And I'll start sending you helpful ideas. But people do like them. You know, there are people who start these things are not very persistent, or whatever they've started is not very good. The average continuity offering, the last time I read any statistics, people kept going for 4 months before on average they dropped off. The thing that I run is a thing called Ask Drayton, which answers lots of questions. And the average length of stay on that particular continuity deal is about 10 months, so it's quite good. And what's even better is you could try it for $1, and you can even get your $1 back if you don't like it. So that's quite good. That actually contains pretty much everything I know about marketing, and people do like it. They do. Either they like it or they're very persistent. They've got extremely bad memories. Drayton Bird, who's that? Last week in the pub, wasn't it?
Amazing. Okay, we will include links to your site and also to where they can sign up for the mailing list. Fantastic. Drayton, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real privilege to talk.
Oh, a pleasure. It's always a pleasure afterwards.
Yeah.
And a misery before.
There's that word again. And finally, thank you to everyone listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do share and review the pod. We massively value support. Keep questions and guest requests coming in. To get in touch, it's easy to find Gasp online. You can check out CTA Pod on Instagram or just email hello@calltoaction.co.
To action, I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try. I can't get no call to action. Oh, I can't get no call to action. Yeah!